You said that you had a fear that people would dress up as Diddy and baby oil. What do you think would lead them to do that?
Some of it is just ignorance and trying to be funny, of trying to elicit kind of responses and conversation on the internet.
In my opinion, Halloween is one of the best times of the year. You have trick-or-treating, carving pumpkins, picking apples, and dressing up in Halloween costumes. Now, while it's so fun to dress as a character you love, costumes aren't always harmless. I'm MC Robinson, and this is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. Today, I'm speaking with
Danielle Graddick. I'm a psychologist and I'm affiliated with JBWS because I've been a board member for a little over a year now.
Dr. Graddick is going to talk about the difference between being edgy and offensive, how dark humor plays into costumes, and how we can avoid triggering victims of violence this Halloween. But before you listen, please take a moment to subscribe to Unsilenced. It really helps us spread the word. All right, now enjoy the episode. Happy spooky season, Danny. I'm loving the cat ears. Do you dress up for Halloween every year?
I do. At this point in my life, I don't go out on Halloween. I like to wait for the trick-or-treaters to come in. So this year I have a little bit more of an aggressive like cat costume. But most of the time it's just like a cat ear and a mask of some sort.
I love it. I'm literally obsessed with dressing up. I love costumes. I'll take literally any chance I get to wear a costume. If you couldn't
Yeah.
tell, I'm pretty obsessed with Halloween. So I'm excited to have this conversation though, because I want everybody to be able to dress up and engage in Halloween in a non-harmful way.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Me too. I'm really excited for this. And I think hopefully this will be helpful to people as they think about what kind of costumes they want before they venture out into the world on Halloween.
Absolutely. It's interesting because I'm wondering, why do you think there is this tendency of people to dress up in inappropriate or even downright offensive costumes? Where do you think that comes from?
You know, I think the first thing I'd say to that is I think a lot of it is ignorance. And by no means am I justifying or, accepting that it's okay to be ignorant. But I do think that sometimes people just don't have the right psychoeducation about why costumes can be offensive. And also the way that, their community is, if there's a community of not having a lot of accountability in terms of their friendships or their family, also learned behavior. Their parents may use a lot of dark humor or just
Mhm.
being, not politically correct. So I think some of the time it's just a matter of ignorance and people just not knowing better and needing to listen to podcasts like this. But the other potentially darker answer that I'll give is like, I think part of it is attention. I think
Mhm.
sometimes, especially these days in our generation, people feel overlooked and people feel kind of ignored in the world. And so this idea of putting on this provocative costume that's going to get what they think is laughs or high fives at the bar or stares is something that's actually harmful to people. But to them, it's like, oh, this is great. So
Yeah. No, it's so interesting that you bring that up because in preparing for this episode, I had the weirdest Google searches. I'm over here like offensive Halloween costumes, but
yeah,
I came across this Reddit post where somebody was literally, they said, I'm looking for mildly offensive Halloween costumes and asked people to give them ideas. And so I'm curious, what's the difference between, like you said, being edgy and kind of funny and a little dark humor versus being harmful and offensive to
yeah,
somebody?
yeah. To me, being edgy is like dyeing your hair a color that you've never dyed it before, or a color that we don't typically see, like a hot pink. Or maybe if you're traditionally someone that doesn't show a lot of skin, maybe it's you're choosing a costume that shows skin and you feel really great in that outfit,
Mhm.
or maybe it's like, a super Halloween fan. So they choose like a Freddy mask and do the whole blood makeup thing
Yeah.
based on something in the movie. To
Mhm.
me, that is edgy. And edgy doesn't hurt other people. Edgy is just something that might feel different to you,
Mhm.
but being harmful and being offensive, that's different. That's something that glorifies domestic violence and minimizes domestic violence. And that's something that actually hurts people. So to me, there's that line there.
In preparing for this episode, I came across so many downright offensive Halloween costumes that I don't think anybody could ever conceivably call edgy. It was things like, and excuse my language, but a wife beater costume, the date rape drug, even rape victims and victims of domestic violence with physical signs of abuse on their body. This might seem obvious to us, but could you break down why is this a problem? Like, how is it harmful to dress in these ways?
Yeah. I think the first thing is it just goes against everything that we do as an organization. Like it just continues to perpetuate this culture of abuse where we think that it's okay to laugh about it. We think that it's okay to make light of it. And it also just glorifies
Mhm.
domestic violence in such a way that is so unnecessary,
Mhm.
and so unhelpful. And I also think that, it's problematic because it hurts people. We don't actually know, and many times people don't know who is impacted by domestic violence. So
Mhm.
you might be going out with one of your buddies and thinking that, your costume is this great thing that's going to get you a bunch of laughs. That person may have witnessed domestic violence in their household. That person may have been a victim of domestic violence or a survivor of domestic violence. So you never know who you might be impacting and who you could hurt. And to me,
Mhm.
it just feels so unnecessary to potentially harm another person.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is kind of another thought on this is if somebody, let's say, dresses up as a victim of abuse, how would you feel as a victim if that was your friend? Do you think that it would make it kind of harder to come forward? What kind of effect or messaging do you think that would send to a victim if, let's say, they're a victim of sexual assault, they're a victim of domestic violence, and their friend is dressing in this way? What kind of messaging do you think that sends?
I think it continues to perpetuate the cycle of silence. I think I could
Oh,
see survivors feeling like, this is why I don't tell anyone anything, or this is why I didn't want to come forward, or this is why
yeah.
I still haven't shared my story because people won't take it seriously because our culture doesn't take it seriously. And it just makes it harder for people like that to come forward and to receive help and receive services. Deeper than that, more psychologically, we don't know what kind of emotional impact that person is then having. So then they're having
Mhm.
to face and potentially, have these thoughts of this is why I don't come forward. And then they might be suffering on the back end. And so it just feels so harmful. And there's just no need to hurt people in that way.
And there's already so much shame associated with being a victim of violence that then you have a lot of people who are then making light of your pain and your suffering. And I think that plays into it too. It then makes it harder if oh, these people are dressing up like this is a joke, this is funny to them. When you go forward and you think about telling them, that's going to be very difficult to overcome that. I think it's interesting because there is a lot of resistance I've seen, particularly online, about fully acknowledging that these costumes could be pretty harmful. You'll see a lot. I don't know if you've seen this, but you'll see a lot. People will say, like, get off Twitter, go touch grass. You're so chronically online. But why do you think there is a resistance to even contemplating that these costumes could have a harmful effect on a victim?
As the world is moving to a place that is more thoughtful and more considerate of other people, that, challenges people and requires them to be accountable and requires them to think about the impact that they have on other people, there's this resistance, typically from people who hold privilege and hold power,
Mhm.
that, why should I have to be a sensitive snowflake, or why do I always need to be politically correct? And so the more I think we culturally and systemically move to a place that is more considerate of other people and more thoughtful, the more these people on the fringes then react and have this like strong resistance to making any potential changes. And so I think it makes people feel more emboldened and more angry. And I don't know, potentially more forgotten about. It's interesting psychologically. So
Yeah, I feel people almost don't want to have to think about how this affects other people. It's like, well, this is a costume. Like, I'm just having fun, like, why does it bother you so much? I think they feel kind of overwhelmed at the thought of having to, and I'll just hear this is quotes I've heard, think of every little thing that could possibly offend a person. And what would you say in response to that? Like, we're not expecting people to like take out a checklist and be like, oh, I can't be a Marvel villain because X, Y, and Z. It's more so about being thoughtful and reflective when someone tells you that they have an issue with your costume. So, like, what would you say in response to that?
I think what I would say is it's not hard to take ownership and accountability over how your actions or how your behaviors or your thoughts might impact someone else's.
Hmm.
It doesn't require much. It just requires you to think a little bit more deeply in your everyday life than you're used to thinking. And again, when people are in a place of privilege and have never experienced things like this, also psychologically, I think a lot of people have these strong defense mechanisms that push that away and say, well, that could never be me. It's never in my family.
Hmm.
But I think that things like that exist and could be so harmful and hurtful to people. So I think that what I would say is it's never too late to, first of all, to be a more accountable person and to be thoughtful of other people. And it's also not hard, and it doesn't cost you anything except a few more thoughts, you
Yeah,
know, a
exactly.
few more.
Just a couple. And I think, that's a really interesting point is we're not over here to say you're a bad person for doing X, Y, and Z. But I think, we learned about this recently actually in a training at work where it's you call people forward to certain things. So if you are able to be called forward and reflect, oh man, like I can understand now that maybe that was like an inappropriate joke. And I think all of us at some point have made that mistake. And it's
Yes,
about, right? Like it's about that accountability of coming forward and being like, that was wrong. I understand. Like I'm listening. I'll do better in the future. But un
exactly.
exactly. And another interesting part of this, though, and like I said, in researching all these costumes, is that there tends to be the joke is about violence against women. There's a
Mhm.
lot of violence, particularly against women. I know it also exists about against men, but in the context of Halloween costumes. And do you think that the treatment of women in our society plays into that? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. The first word that comes to mind when I think about that is patriarchy and
Mm,
the patriarchal society that we live in, and how, there's always been this kind of unequal power dynamic between men and women. And I think specifically straight cisgender males, white males who come from a place of privilege and have looked at, even religiously or historically, women as people to own or people to control,
yeah.
which is why it took women longer to have rights. And so I think the trickle down effect of that is just these messages that people receive subliminally in the news and the media when you're listening to music,
Mhm.
that makes men think that it's okay to look at women as less than, and that makes it okay for men to think that it's okay to commit acts of violence against them. And so I think it is just so deeply entrenched into our society and
Mm.
specifically into our culture. There's a trickle down effect, as there is with so many things.
Yeah, and do you think it also speaks to this tendency to make light of abuse in general in our society? Like, or maybe dismiss people that are experiencing abuse as hysterical and crazy? I think it feeds into that narrative. How do you feel?
I think it does too. And again, I know I mentioned this before, but psychologically, when there are things that cause so much pain and so much harm to people, I think we put up walls and defense mechanisms and justifications as to why that couldn't happen, or it doesn't happen, or it doesn't happen as much as we think it does,
Mhm.
or it doesn't impact women the way that we think it does, because it's easier to think like that than it is to actually consider how much pain and suffering people have experienced, and
Mhm.
specifically survivors have experienced.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a lot to process, but what blows my mind is how widespread this problem is. I mean, people will actually dress up as victims of domestic violence, like as I mentioned earlier, but with the physical signs of abuse on their face, bruising, cuts. Great example of this is that woman who plays Stevie in Schitt's Creek dressed up as Johnny Depp, and a friend of hers, maybe it was her partner, I don't know, dressed up as Amber Heard, and it was intentionally to make light of and make fun of abuse. Now, she did eventually apologize for that and recognize that it was wrong, but we'll see people dressing up as Chris Brown and Rihanna once again with the physical signs of abuse. Why do you think people do this?
In preparing for this podcast, I asked my trainer about this, and my trainer, who she gave me permission to talk about this, I'm not going to say her name, but she is 24 and she like Halloween is her favorite holiday. And so I asked her, what would you ever think about if you saw people at a bar dressed up as Chris Brown and Rihanna? And her first response was like, my friend and I have actually considered doing that before. And I just asked her why. Like, what is it about that? And this is someone that I've known for years that I love very deeply. She's, not again, not that this justifies anything, but an educated woman, and someone that I would think is kind of aware of these issues. But she kind of said, because I have dark humor. And she's like, if you look at me and my friends' exchanges, we exchange memes or videos that have shock value or dark humor. And she said that she thinks her generation, I think Gen Z, and again, I'm not saying this is all of Gen Z, but
Right.
her opinion was that they kind of cope with trauma and painful events by making light or making humor of it. And so I specifically asked her about Rihanna and Chris Brown, and I asked her, well, if you dress like that, how would you portray Rihanna? And she said, well, if you're going to do it with Chris Brown, I would put the bruising on. So
Um,
I don't fully understand, but I think there are so many reasons for this. I think educate again, like I said before, just a lack of education about these issues and ignorance. And I also think, if I can get deep for a second, this internalized sexism that comes from patriarchy that has sort of trickled down into women is also why women dress like this and why women make fun of domestic violence survivors. Over time, when you're constantly receiving messages in society that you're not good enough or that you're not, as powerful as the man, or that love and relationship and marriage is all that you should aspire to be, those messages kind of trickle in and then we project onto other people. And so I think people aren't even aware sometimes of how these messages has infiltrated their system, and then they kind of end up committing these acts in the world and making light of these issues. So
It is so interesting to me because I agree. It's almost like a wire isn't plugged in somewhere because it's like to us, I think, because we are in this work, there's an obvious connection, right? But to other people who aren't, I think it's very easy to just almost not fully grasp that there's real people on the other side. And that's not shade at anyone because I do think, like I said, this is something that we do as humans. There's a tendency to like almost disconnect. And, I think going into that dark humor is a very interesting angle because how does dark humor differ from maybe making a problem worse, right? Because you can cope through dark humor. I think we've even talked about this. There's trauma that you can joke about when that's your own trauma, when that's your own experience. But when it's externally based, why does that start to maybe get into a territory that's a little dangerous or a little offensive?
Mm. When it's externally based like that, A, you don't know who you're impacting or who's receiving that message about domestic violence.
Yeah.
Uh, and B, it just potentially causes so much harm and mocks what they experienced,
Hmm.
hurts people. And
Hmm.
I think at the core of what we're saying, MC, it's we, people can have the best intentions in the world, but when your humor goes the extra mile and causes, and again is externally based, that is painful and triggering for people who have
Hmm.
this or who have experienced this, or people like us who are trying to work to end domestic violence.
Yeah. And it's intent versus impact, which is one of my favorite phrases, right? Because it's like, okay, maybe your intent is to have dark humor and like make light of this to process it because we live in a difficult world. But then what is the impact, right? Because if you have a victim of abuse that sees that you're dressing up in this way, maybe they will hesitate. And we don't want victims to hesitate to reach out for help or to feel that their story is something to be made fun of. And I
Mm.
think that is like kind of the key point of this.
I think that you're exactly right. We want, and anyone listening to this podcast, whether you're someone who has made an offensive joke or whether you're someone who has, worn a costume that we are considering offensive, or whether you're a survivor who have experienced abuse in any kind of way, shape, or form, I think we are just trying to educate the masses and
Yes.
explain why it is that this is hurtful and why it is that this kind of goes against the work that we do, and why it's also never too late to just change, and never too
Yes.
late to take ownership and to, check in with other people about the costumes that you might want to wear too. You can
Mhm.
ask questions. You can go to people who you know are not afraid to check you.
No, and that's the important part is recognizing that like I do think we've all been thoughtless at different points in our life, and that doesn't make you a bad person or unable to change. But, if you're wearing a costume and you hear feedback from somebody like this is really kind of problematic or this like I think could hurt people, I think what we're saying is just listen. I know you're not an expert in diagnosing people based on their Halloween costumes. But do you think there is an element of anonymity or something about costumes that almost allows people to behave in these inappropriate ways that I just don't think that they would make these kinds of jokes if they weren't maybe in a costume? Do you know what I mean? Where there was some level of anonymity to them. What do you think?
Totally. That's such a good question. I think it allows people to feel bold and emboldened, and it allows
Mhm.
people to kind of act out on their thoughts and on their fantasies, and that can get really dark, but absolutely.
Yes.
Because there's also, and I think what people think in their minds is, or maybe this is even subconscious, there's no real accountability there. There's no
Mhm.
fear of personal consequences. I mean, what, someone's gonna like take off your makeup and pull the costume over your head and then post you on the internet? I don't know.
Mhm.
So I do think it's easier for people to dress harmfully and dress in a way that makes light of domestic violence survivors, because of the anonymity. It
Mhm.
also reminds me of cyberbullying and just like how
Mhm.
much of that we
Mhm.
also see in this day and age too, because people can hide behind their usernames and say anything, no matter how much it harms people. Or
Mhm.
there's this real like cycle of no accountability, and there's real
Mhm.
this just idea that people can be bold, with no consequence.
Totally. But also I think people have a tendency to see what's current and just kind of participate, even if it's harmful. I mean, we talked about this before we met for this episode, but you said that you had a fear that people would dress up as Diddy and Baby Oil because one, it sounds like to some people that could be funny or it's also current. So why do you think this is a problem and why do you think what do you think would lead them to do that?
So the reason why that came to me, and I hope that my friends who are listening, receive this, but I've seen some of my friends that I've known for years, people that I've gone to college with,
Mhm.
who have been posting memes about Diddy and posting like videos and skits about the baby oil thing. And
Mhm.
knowing these people the way that I do, again, going back to the first thing we talked about, some of it is just ignorance and trying to be funny,
Mhm.
and trying to be like edgy and, trying to elicit kind of responses and conversation on the internet. But I think also culturally, specifically within the Black community, it's been hard to hold people like Diddy accountable for his actions, because this idea that someone could make music that we've all danced and celebrated to, we've all, someone who's been like an icon in the music industry
Mhm.
could do such horrific things is something that we can't even like begin to process. Again, going back to what I said earlier, just about psychologically people putting up such defense mechanisms to justify violence like that.
Yeah.
Um, but I think people can have good intentions, but it's harmful and it's hurtful. You don't know what kind of messages that is sending to people who have experienced any kind of violence.
But you're right, it is so common. And I do think part of this ties into that dark humor that we talked about a little bit earlier. But I have a friend who does the same thing where he will make the most inappropriate jokes, but in his mind, like he is a huge supporter of victims and of people that are experiencing it. But externally, I don't think you would ever know that because of the way the jokes come off, and we've gotten into it a lot. Um, but it is just kind of it's interesting once again if you go back to intent versus impact. To me, it's just very interesting that alarm bells aren't going off in their heads when they're engaging with certain content, thinking about dressing up in certain ways. Like, what would you suggest a person consider when they're thinking about a costume or when they're thinking about, even to your point, sharing something about DV? What do you think they should consider?
I think the first thing is to consider, if I wore this out in the world, is there anyone who could potentially look at this and feel a way? Maybe feel hurt, feel offended, feel angry, feel fearful. You
Mhm.
know, when I put on my cat costume, I hope that people are not looking at a cat and having reactions like that. And I think that's the first thing, is be aware of how people might consider it, but also Google is free. And in
Yeah.
preparing for this episode, we looked at Reddit threads, Twitter, TikTok. I searched
Mhm.
everything,
Me too.
like why people do this stuff. And I would say go on the internet and ask, is this offensive or why? There's actually a lot of really good data out there, and it's free to do.
Yeah. I think the only person that would be offended by a cat is a dog, so I think you're good.
Yeah.
Do you have anything else that you want to talk about?
I think the thing that I just want to mention is, if you're listening to this podcast and you have dressed like this, as I've said, we are not trying to shame you or make you feel bad intentionally. We
Yes.
are just trying to shed light on why you can potentially make a different decision this Halloween and choose a costume that doesn't hurt people and doesn't go against the mission that we're working really hard to achieve. So
Yes.
feel free to reach out to me, to email me if you want to talk about it, or if you want, ideas on Halloween costumes. I'm all in for that. But this is not the shame zone. It's just
No.
a where we're trying to educate people so that we can have a Halloween, and survivors can also have a Halloween experience that doesn't kind of trigger symptoms and thoughts and memories and flashbacks that they've experienced.
Yeah, and I love what you said because that is the whole purpose of talking about abuse in general is that we don't talk about it enough. So I'm not faulting people for this. I am saying like I think we should start talking about it and start reflecting and being more aware and mindful, but that's not to say once again that you're a bad person. Like you're a byproduct of a society that minimizes abuse. So of course sometimes you're going to make the wrong move. And that is not a reflection or a judgment on character. And I will say, when I was in high school, I remember we used to think that sexual assault jokes were funny. I definitely made them. And that to me is embarrassing to admit, especially working in this work and experiences of life. And I think as we grow and as we change and as we learn, we can include the things that we've learned and just do better. And that's the purpose. But I don't think anybody's a bad person for dressing away in the past as long as they can reflect and move forward in a different way.
Exactly. Exactly. That's beautiful. If I can just add one thing, it'd also be, don't be afraid to check your friends. Even my trainer this morning, when I was talking to her about this, I just told her why it is that, we were recording this podcast, and why it is that could, is a hurtful thing to do. It wasn't awkward. It didn't cost me
Yeah.
anything. She didn't walk away feeling shameful. It's okay to check people, and it's okay to advocate for yourself or advocate for survivors. And I hope that you can make those decisions moving
Yeah, and
forward.
that's so empowering is that we are all a community and we are all in this work together. And so it doesn't take much to be like, dude, I don't know if that costume's really getting the message that you want. And just because truthfully, sometimes people genuinely have not thought about it or they don't realize it. And so, going back to my analogy from earlier, it's kind of our job to connect that wire that's missing and be like, maybe just try and see it from this perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that's why these conversations matter. So, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And I hope everyone enjoys themselves and has a safe Halloween.
Thank you, Danny, for coming on the podcast and sharing your thoughts on this topic. I really appreciated your insights. Now, while discussing Halloween costumes may seem like something relatively small, it all contributes to a culture that undermines the experiences of victims. To end domestic violence, we must all work together to break the silence around abuse in all facets of society, no matter how small. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations About Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency serving Morris County, New Jersey. Please let us know what topics you would like covered on this podcast by sending an email to podcast@jbws.org. Please note that this email address is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or access to services. If you live or work in Morris County and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, JBWS is here to help. Please visit our website at jbws.org to learn more about our services, or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to members of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you recognize controlling or abusive behaviors in yourself, JBWS can also help change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and adolescent males who have used abusive or controlling behaviors in their relationships. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973-539-7801 to learn more. If you don't live in Morris County, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Domestic violence grows in silence, so thank you so much for listening and helping us break through that silence through these types of conversations. Please follow us on social media and continue to share our content to get as many people talking about domestic abuse as possible.